Thanks, Dean, for being here. It's such a
Thank you
pleasure.
for having me. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay.
Let's just talk about a handful of things. I want to start with Civil Beat, and I want to start with why you're here in Hawaii. And I think we've got an audience here. You gave a great talk. Was it yesterday at Civil Beat, or was it the day before?
Day before.
It was the day before yesterday. And a great talk at Civil Beat that was available to the public. And you guys can go online and find it, right, Ben? Patty too. So it's just a wonderful talk about kind of why Dean is here in Hawaii from his great work with Civil Beat and his role at the Times. And his work has been with Blaze Lovell, who's standing right back there in the corner. Blaze, wave your hand. And Shaka. Blaze is one of the many outstanding investigative reporters and journalists who care deeply about covering Hawaii and making Hawaii a better and more accountable place under the leadership of Patty and Ben and the whole team. But if you don't mind sharing, as background for everyone who might not have seen the talk, a little bit about what you've been doing with Blaze and why you're here, just give that context.
So 2 years ago, when I stepped aside as editor of the Times, the publisher and I decided to create a program because we were worried about the collapse of local journalism, which is a crisis, a true American crisis. And there's a sub-crisis within it, which is the collapse of local investigative journalism. Because investigative journalism takes time, money, and risk. It's the kind of reporting where you go in and you actually don't know if you're going to land anything. And that's hard for newsrooms that have been shrunk over time to do. So we created this program where journalists all over the country apply to work with the Times for a year. And for a year, they become New York Times reporters. We edit them. We work closely with their news organizations. And they pitch to us an investigative idea. And frankly, Blaze's investigative pitch, I guess it's a year and a half ago, was just terrific. I mean, it really was. It was to look at the role of contracting and people who make campaign contributions and how they dominate contracting in Hawaii. And it was just so terrific, frankly, that when we were dividing up the dozen fellows we would work with, I asked my colleagues if I could work with Blaze. And it was just a terrific project. It really was. We were able to use data journalism to prove the extent of the influence so that it wasn't purely anecdotal. And I thought I was working, frankly, with a young reporter who was going to have a sustained career as an investigative reporter in Hawaii, and I learned a lot from him. And so we have reporters all over the country. We've done a lot of work in Mississippi, Wisconsin, and we try to visit the newsrooms just to spend time with them and meet with the people who care about their coverage. And that's why I'm in Hawaii, though, frankly, it was not a tough sell. I won't say anything about my fellows who are in Mississippi, but this was an easy sell to come here.
One of the things that Shangri-La believes that it is, and I think everyone who comes here kind of feels it and sees it, has been hinted at, is a place of transformation. It's a place of great complexity, like Hawaii. There's a lot of, what is this doing here? It's beautiful. Should this be here? How did it get here? The kind of combination of art and architecture and nature, kind of it's just a sensory overload for a lot of people. And there's a lot to think about in terms of Doris Duke and her story and privilege and art and beauty and who has what in Hawaii. So there's just a lot of layers here to unpack. And it's one of the reasons that so many people love Shangri-La, not just because of its overt beauty. And so it's a place where we like to have conversations that get into transformation and thinking about change and thinking about the layers and complexity of life. So if you don't mind, if we can get a little existential for a moment.
Not at all.
I'd love to talk to you about, you've had many, at least for those of us who have been colleagues and following your career, we've seen the kind of changes and transformations you've gone through publicly, from leaving as the executive editor to the Times to this incredible role you're in now. We've seen you leave the New York Times for the LA Times and then go back to the New York Times to run it. And I'm sure there's been many transformations and changes in your life that are lesser known. So I would just love for you to talk about
Yeah.
how you see change, if you don't mind.
No, 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 not at all. It's interesting. So 2 minutes of background about me. Actually, I always get anxious when people say I graduated from Columbia University. I actually dropped out. Um, I start, I started work as a journalist at 19. I left college. I went back home to New Orleans and started working for the afternoon paper. I've been working, and then I was the editor. Eventually, became the editor of the LA Times and the editor of the New York Times. And those are really intensive jobs. You can't overstate how intense they are. I mean, you live with your phone literally next to your bedside. You never turn your phone off. Just never. And the transformation for me over the last 2 years, which is I read more. I've always been a big reader. I've thought a lot about journalism, the good and bad of journalism. I've thought a lot about, you have to think if you've worked as intensively as I have, you think about the things you gave up because you don't become, you don't start where I started. I grew up in the back of a restaurant in New Orleans. My parents ran a neighborhood restaurant. You don't start where I started and become the executive editor of the New York Times without giving stuff up along the way. And I actually think I've thought a lot more about that. I try to spend more time with my son because he says that he doesn't remember the time I didn't spend with him. I think he's being nice. So I actually think I'm in the middle of I'm giving back to journalism. This program is not, there's nothing in this program for the New York Times. It's a completely altruistic program. It's the Times is funding it. And I think a lot about what journalism has done for me. And I think a lot about what things in journalism are good, which I think is mostly good. I've thought a lot about what things I would do differently as a journalist. And I don't think I've ever had, so I stepped aside almost 2 years ago. I don't think I've had that much time to just reflect on a life and a career. Somebody asked me, more than one person have asked me if I wanted to write a memoir, and I said, absolutely not. I do not want to do that. But I've thought a lot about transformation and change. And it just so happens that my profession is changing dramatically. There's a whole new generation coming into the profession of journalism who ask hard questions. I grew up in a world where you didn't ask hard questions. If the editor said, jump, you jumped. And that's not true in the next generation, with the next generation of journalists. Frankly, I like this, even though it makes me uncomfortable. I like people to jump a little bit. It makes me uncomfortable. It's been good for me to think about it. So I actually think I'm in the middle of, you told me that you might ask this. I actually think I'm in the middle of a pretty substantial internal and external transformation.
You've done a lot of great things for journalism, for the industry, for the spread of truth and knowledge. So thank you for that. You went through, and I was at CNN at the same time. You went through I don't know how you think about the eras of news and cycles you've gone through, but you went through a period where there was a global pandemic, a racial reckoning in the summer of 2020, an election, an insurrection, and all at the same time, kind of a new culture that was emerging in newsrooms, and not just newsrooms, and other organizations as well. So how'd that go for you? I mean, how do you think about those news cycles and those moments where things were so intense, knowing the job was as intense as it was, and even in the slow news days, you had that phone near you. How did you deal with all of that change all at once?
I have a lot of thoughts. It was really difficult, really difficult. I mean, Trump was a difficult president to cover. The pandemic was extraordinarily difficult. I mean, just extraordinarily difficult to know the balance between providing information needed that people needed to cope with their lives, the science, which was new to everybody. I mean, even all the scientists didn't quite know what to do. It was extraordinarily difficult. I will say, I don't think as a journalist I've ever felt more needed or necessary. I felt like readers really wanted to understand how to deal with the pandemic. They really wanted to understand how to deal with the political and social changes in America. So at the height of the pandemic, it just so happened my family was in California, and my son was graduating from grad school in Los Angeles, and I was there for that. And then I flew back to New York. And not long after I flew back, it became clear all businesses were shut down. So the newsroom was shut down. So I was running the New York Times from the dining table in my apartment in New York, in Greenwich Village. And it just so happened that all of the demonstrations started at Union Square, which was like 5 blocks from where I worked. And every evening, being editor of a major news organization, I don't know if Patty has the same experience, there's a certain distance from the news, whether you like it or not, because you're sitting in a newsroom, you're sort of closeted and surrounded. So every night at the end of the news cycle, we'd put the paper to bed. I'm sitting at my dining table with a laptop. I would throw on a jacket, and I would just walk out into Union Square, and I would watch the demonstrations. And I thought, I'm living in the middle of history. So on the one hand, it was really difficult and challenging. The staff was restive, which is hard to manage. On the other hand, the whole country was restive. Why should my staff be any different? But I also felt like we were necessary. We were like needed. I've never had so many people stop me on the street and thank me for coverage. So it was hard, but it was also a reminder of why we're in the business. So, for the most part, hard, but my God, was it a rewarding. There was one moment which is going to tell you more about New York than it is about anything else. As you can imagine, New York City was not pro-Trump, especially Greenwich Village was not pro-Trump. So the morning, and it was a morning, CNN called, I guess, or Fox called the election, I'm going to get my days wrong, but like a Friday night. We were more cautious because we have our whole system. So I'm sitting at my dining table with a Zoom call with all of the people involved in calling the election, the polling operation, the managing editor, and everybody else. And we're finally making the decision we're going to call, I guess Wisconsin was the last state that put it over. And I've never had this experience. Sitting at the table, all of a sudden, so I say, okay, let's call it. The alert goes out within a minute. Another minute, I could hear cheers on the streets right outside my door. And I thought, that does not happen all the time. So hard, but historic.
Since a Trump presidency and potentially a second one, but since the first one put kind of journalists in this situation where you're weighing for the first time publicly, do you call something a lie? Do you call someone a liar? Right? So I'm thinking about how you addressed advocacy journalism, and can you just say that this guy's not doing the right thing according to the tenets of journalism? Or can you not say that? Because guess what? The majority of the population, now we won't get into the electoral college. Sorry, I was about to go down there. But he was elected. And so how did you address that in the newsroom? And if you can, how do you think about what's happening right now? And is there going to be a Biden presidency, a Harris presidency, a Trump presidency? Or
Now you're getting hard.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah. What do you think?
Well, first off, we were just as surprised as you all were. In fact, the tradition is they bring to the executive editor 2 front pages. And frankly, most elections of the last generation have been close enough to, nobody brought me a Trump front page. And I said, you got to give me a Trump front page. If for no other reason, other than tradition. He was as surprised, by the way, as I mean, we had people in his headquarters, and he wasn't expecting to win. Um, you know, I we were the first ones to use the word lie in reference to Trump, and the reason the reason was he had the moment was when when he finally said that Barack Obama was born in the United States, because if you look back at what he had said before that, he actually not only did he raise questions about where he was born, he actually said he had private investigators looking into it and they had found interesting stuff. Well, that was clearly a lie. So that was the first time we used the word lie. And we've used it since. I think you got to use it sparingly. The rule was when I was the editor, I wanted to know when we used it because, look, I don't want, if the governor of Maine says her budget is $220 million, and it turns out that it's $240 million, I don't want to use I don't want lie to proliferate so much in the pages of the New York Times that it just loses its power and its force, right? Because, I mean, is that really a lie or who knows? So that we were the first ones to use it. You know, I looked to history, and it turns out that in moments of extraordinary crisis and coverage, American newspapers have, in fact, while holding on to whether you want to call it objectivity or just fairness, have actually go back and look at David Halberstam's coverage of Vietnam. It was like somebody took a page from a whole nother newspaper and glued it onto the front page of the New York Times. He was essentially saying very forcefully that America was losing and there was no way it could be turned around. Go back and look at the best coverage of the civil rights movement. And even people like Jill Lelyveld, who was my friend and mentor, wrote very forcefully about what the South was like during that period. So I do think that there is, within the realm of of striving for fairness and independence, and I care more about independence than objectivity, within that realm, there is still room to write tough coverage and to call a lie a lie. And I think the best news organizations have done that. Have we fumbled sometimes? Of course. I said this a couple of days ago, I'll say it again. News organizations are by their nature flawed. They have to be. We produce thousands of stories a week about a whole range of subjects, from movie reviews to dicey political stories to local coverage to Wordle. There is no way that everything we do can be flawless, and we need to own up to that. But I actually think that there was a way. I mean, when I was the editor, we got hold of Trump's taxes, and wrote very forcefully about it. Even before we did that, we were the first ones to write stories about his abuse of women, and we were the first ones to write stories that said that Donald Trump did not make his money himself, that his father had given him so much money that even if, I can't remember the exact line, but even if he had done nothing but invest it safely, he would have as much money as he did now. So I think that even within the realm of independence, and the reason, frankly, that I defend the New York Times and other news organizations writing about Joe Biden and the issues of his age, that is a legitimate news story. And you can't say that because we don't want Donald Trump to win, and I'm not saying that's the Times' view, but that's the way a lot of Americans feel. Please don't write about Joe Biden's age. Joe Biden's age, Donald Trump's age, are legitimate news stories. And independence means that you ask hard questions of everybody. And I think that holding on to that, frankly, and holding on to that history, and I had sitting in my office when I was the editor a book called Covering Vietnam, which I would look back at Homer Biggert and David Halberstam and all the coverage of Vietnam and covering civil rights. And I would look back at Lelyveld and all the others And there was room in independence to also just sort of call people out.
Thank you for that. Do you think, one more on kind of the summer of 2020 and the racial reckoning in particular, as you were the first Black editor of the New York Times.
And actually of the LA Times, too.
And of the LA Times, right. I mean, what's next, you know? And I was thinking of that summer and that moment and all the coverage and the conversations where the news became, you know, you talked about it with the election, but the news became personal in newsrooms.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about how you experience that with the staff. And I'm curious about you, what you observe now from a little bit on the outside on what appears to be, maybe you agree or not, a backlash against diversity and equity and inclusion. And do you think that's happening or not? And how did you kind of deal with that at the time and think about what what diversity means for the sake of a fair and fulsome news report?
I don't think a journalism organization can cover a community fairly and accurately if it's not diverse. I mean, the newsrooms I started in had very few women, and the women who were in the newsrooms covered quote unquote women news. And I don't think how could those newsrooms have actually covered their cities with any kind of like thought or balance if half the people who lived in those cities were not reflected in their coverage and the interest? I mean, American newsrooms didn't start writing about the whole range of issues that affected women and later minorities until they started looking like those newsrooms. So I think diversity is not, we can have a debate about the justice of it, but a newsroom is supposed to reflect, not precisely, but a newsroom is supposed to be connected enough to its community to cover it with some accuracy. One of the other things I tried to do, by the way, was to make sure that the newsroom had veterans in it. Because how can you cover, like we were covering 2 wars? How can you cover those 2 wars without people who had experienced those wars, without people who had experienced the loss of seeing friends who died in war? So I think you can't, it's got to look like, so, you know, there were a lot of uncomfortable conversations in the newsroom because the people who came in who looked different than the traditional journalists and newsrooms wanted to push us in certain directions. And frankly, my view of that is that's fine within limits. There are limits. If you sign up to work for the New York Times, you have to accept certain things. You cannot publicly spout off your political positions. You just can't. It endangers the independence of the newsroom. If the 2,000 people who work in the New York Times newsroom are all tweeting all day about whatever they care about, you can't do that. But if you want to challenge me, and if you want to say, Dean, I think you're wrong on this one, in the end, I get to decide. Otherwise, we'd never put out a daily news report. But I believe you got to listen. You know, I once had a young reporter who I had recruited from another news organization. And I knew in recruiting her that centrally she believed the things I believed. But there was something she wanted to push me on. So I sat down at lunch with her, and I'll never forget this conversation. We were arguing. I never argued with Jill Ellieveld, but I wanted people to argue with me. So I'm arguing with her, and at the end of the conversation, in which I finally said, "Look, we're going to have. I hate to say it, but we're going to have to do it my way." She looked at me and she said, "What did you think was going to happen when you hired people like me? Did you think we were just going to be just like you, but younger?" And I remember thinking, I kind of hope that, but I guess not.
All right, I want to follow up on my earlier question, and then we'll open up for any conversations or comments or questions folks have for Dean. Just noting you didn't answer my question on who's going to win the election. So
I'm not that's the only thing I'll punt.
Are you going to make a prediction? I mean,
Not I'll so
I know he wouldn't, but
here's my record of predictions. When I was managing editor of the LA Times, I went to Barack Obama. Barack Obama gave a very famous speech at one of the big these annual press associations in Washington that I always hated and eventually took us out of. And David Axelrod, who was an Obama aide, but also is a longtime Chicago reporter, so I knew him from Chicago. And I went up for drinks with him afterward, and he said, "Dean, Barack Obama could be president of the United States." And I said to him, "You are out of your mind." So I make no predictions.